Friends, the topic given to me is caste and law. I happen to be a lawyer among other things, so they seem to have chosen this topic for me. Caste was the law in our country for centuries. Today we are discussing law in the context of overcoming caste, in the context of overcoming caste, disabilities, discrimination, annihilation of caste, whatever it is. So it's that very change is a very significant change. It was the law for centuries. Maybe not law in the modern sense. Law in the pre-modern times may not have been as universally implemented as in modern times. On the other hand, it may have been more cruelly implemented when it was than in modern times. I won't go into that distinction. It was a law in the sense of being a binding norm of social conduct enforced violently by those in power. That's the characteristic of law, and in that sense, caste was the law in Hindu society for centuries. Today things have changed to such an extent that we are able to discuss what is the role that law is playing in overcoming caste. The reason being that the very expectations about law have changed. Law in the sense of dharma, the expression used in Hindu society, is merely a declaration of the nature of the world. Dharma is a declaration of this is the nature of the world, that is dharma. Unalterable nature of the world, the way it is created by the Creator. Today the expectation is, even today law does declare that this is the sanctioned order of society. It still does so. Simultaneously, law also provides scope for change, and it is there that we are locating the discussion of law vis-a-vis caste. Time given to me is slight, but this is a topic which one can expound for any amount of time. There are three things we have to look at. One is the Constitution of India vis-a-vis caste. Second is the other legal provisions, statutory provisions. Third, of course, is the courts. Courts are very important because the law is not what the legislature made. The law is what the courts say the legislature made. That's a very important distinction. Even a lawmaker, an MLA or MP cannot say, I made a different law. He is not allowed to say. Once the court says, this is the law you have made, that is the law. And the legislature will have to amend the law if they feel this is not the law they made. Which, for instance, happened very recently when the Supreme Court of India, 7 judges declared it is unconstitutional to direct the private sector colleges to give reservation. That judgment is unconstitutional. But even if the constitution makers had been alive today, they would simply have to amend the constitution. They can't do anything. And they have amended the constitution now. A totally unnecessary amendment caused by unconstitutional judgment. That's just to illustrate the... When you look at the constitution, a positive significant feature is that it outlaws caste. It declares that not only untouchability is declared to be unconstitutional, but any discrimination on the basis of caste is declared to be unconstitutional, and this is placed in the chapter on fundamental rights. So it's a fundamental right of every citizen not to be discriminated on the ground of caste. That is the positive feature of the Constitution. It's a positive right not to be discriminated on the ground of caste, among other things, on the ground of religion, on the ground of gender, on the ground of community, language, region, but also caste. But otherwise, and this is a general criticism we can make about the Constitution of India, that it does contain a number of goals, objectives, directives, which are in the direction of social, economic, and political justice, but its instruments are very weak. The Constitution of India is positive from a human rights point of view to the extent that it does include a number of directives and goals which are conducive to the enlargement of human rights. But the instruments it provides are extremely weak. And that is not an accident, because the assumption underlying the kind of constitution we have is that it is the administration which is going to bring about the change, which is, let us say, hoped for by the constitution, and not positive initiative from the affected people themselves. Now, if we had had a constitution which relied on the initiative of the concerned people who need the rights, who need justice, for achieving justice, the instruments would have been stronger. Instruments are weak precisely because the reliance was placed on the administration, the legislature, and the executive, to bring about the changes, which was unrealistic and of course has largely failed. So instruments are weak. But that they were weaker than even intended was discovered by the rulers of this country when reservations in education, which were there prior to the constitution, both in British India and in Indian states, at a time when neither British India had a constitution with a welfare goal, nor the Indian states had constitutions with welfare goals, yet, at least in South India, there were reservations in educational institutions. But after getting a constitution which has a goal of social justice, political justice, economic justice, it was found that reservations are unconstitutional. It did not strike the judges of the Supreme Court. That's a very odd judgment to have given. That till yesterday they were lawful. They were being implemented in Madras, Mysore. They went back to 40, 50 years prior to the writing of the Indian Constitution. In societies, in states which had no binding or mandatory constitutional goals of welfare or justice. Having got a constitution which declares such goals, it was found that under the constitution, reservations in education institutions are unconstitutional, and then constitution had to be amended, and Article 15, Clause 4 had to be included, which is an instrument, one of the instruments, a mild instrument, but still an instrument, that it enables once again the state to make special provisions for socially and educationally backward classes. Now, why they use the word backward classes, why did they not specifically say castes, was it good, bad? It's a very big discussion which I don't think I have time to go into, but they use the word backward classes. Once again, it is formulated as something which allows the government to do something, rather than as an instrument in the hands of the people to achieve something, to achieve change, to overcome discrimination. For a long time, it was seen only as an enabling provision that if the government wants to, it can give reservations. That's all Article 15.4 was supposed to mean. Similarly, Article 16.4 in employment. It took a long time for the Supreme Court to express the view that it is not merely enabling, it's a positive right. And that view survived only for 5 years or 6 years. Again, this court has gone back to the old view. 1989, Justice Madan in one judgment said, if a class of citizens are actually, as a matter of fact, socially, educationally backward, they have a right to be given reservations. They have a right to ask for it and take it. And he deduced this not by going into Indian history, the specificities of caste and caste discrimination, but from a well-accepted principle of administrative law, that if the government has a power to do something, and that power is for a public purpose, then it must do that thing. It can't say, it's my will and pleasure, I will do or I won't do. For instance, it has the power to give drinking water. It can't say, whether I give or not, it's my will and pleasure. It has to give because it's a public purpose. There may be other powers the governments have which are not public purposes. That's the discretion of the government. So this is a simple principle which everyone will understand. Applying this to reservations, Justice Madan said, since giving of reservations is a public purpose, it is for taking society forward in the direction of an egalitarian society, in the direction of social, political justice, economic justice. Therefore, the power to give reservations is not discretionary. You must give if the conditions are there. 1989, he gave this judgment. 1996, the present chairman of the National Human Rights Commission, Justice Anand, went back on this and said, nothing doing. It's only an enabling provision. If the government gives, you take, otherwise you have no right to ask for it. That is the law today. I said, what the Constitution is what the courts declared it to be. And now the courts have declared that this provision, which goes a little beyond merely declaring caste to be outlawed, which allows people who have been discriminated on the ground of caste to have some benefit, something which will enable them to go forward from what was perhaps intended to be an instrument in the hands of the people. It was relegated to merely an enabling provision, a power in the hands of the government alone for a long time. For a very short time, it was declared to be an instrument. Again, it has gone back to the old view. That's the way courts have been interpreting. In fact, if one is to talk of reservations, if one goes through the entire history of the Supreme Courts, one must say it struggled with the concept of reservations. Well, our courts are the bastion of the upper caste. For a very long time, they continue to be so. It is one area where they are resisting very strongly any notion of reservations. And the struggle that these judges have had with the notion that caste is a very fundamental reality of Indian society, that positive measures are required to overcome caste. The struggle that they have had with this very notion is very obvious if you go through all the judgments. It took a long time for courts even to say. In the beginning, they went on saying that everyone should have equal opportunity in employment and education, so giving reservations is an exception to equal opportunity. That's what they went on saying. The reservations are an exception to equality. It sounds absurd, but that's how they formulated it. Here, equality meant equality in the sense that every application has to be equally treated. When you go for employment or for a seat in an educational institution, that was equality. So giving reservations is an exception. That's how they saw it for a very long time. It was 25 years after the Constitution was written that for the first time they said reservation is not an exception to equality, it's something in the furtherance of equality. It should be obvious. It took the judges of the Supreme Court, the most meritorious judicial brains in the country, 25 years to say this. It is something which is in the furtherance of equality. But today, if you go through the recent judgments, you'll find that they are going back. They don't declare that they are going back, but they are in fact going back. And today, the reality which I think citizens have not fully realized is that whether any class of people will get reservations or not is not going to be decided by the government, which all said and done, in spite of corruption, in spite of everything, they have to be elected and therefore they are responsive to social conditions. They are not going to decide, the courts are going to decide. The courts have gradually usurped the power of the government to give reservations without declaring it to be. They can't declare because the Constitution won't allow them to declare, but in fact they are doing so. In fact, they are doing so. And a very recent judgment of our High Court, when they struck down reservations given to Muslims, a principle laid down is that, I won't go into the technical details, a principle of proportionality which was developed in American administrative law recently has now been imported at least by one judge of our High Court, who says, we will not only see whether you have the power to give reservations, we will not only see whether you have enough data with you, we will also see whether it is proper on your part to give reservations. That means we will decide policy. That principle of proportionality, he said, we will enforce in the matter of reservations, and that is the ground on which 5 judges of the High Court struck down the reservation given to Muslims, declaring that the High Court thinks Muslims don't deserve reservations. The High Court has no business to think this way or that way. It only has to see whether the constitutional power is there with the government, have they followed it in a rational, reasonable manner, that's all. Policy making is not their business, but they have declared it, and we can be sure that in future, issues of reservation, the policy is going to be determined one way or the other by the courts. One judgment of the other one can see this trend. If I am focusing on reservation, it's not because it is the most important thing, it is the only thing available. As I said in the very beginning, the instruments available in the Constitution for overcoming caste, disabilities and discrimination are very few. As in general, the Constitution's instruments for achieving the goals of social, economic, political justice are very few and slight in number. Reservations is one, and even that has been disabled in this manner, especially, in fact, mainly by the courts and their understanding. So that repeatedly Parliament has been forced to amend the Constitution. 2 amendments have come. One is that in promotions also reservations can be given. How did the courts discover it cannot be given? One doesn't know. In fact, if you look at the declarations being made by the courts in the matter of reservations, they don't even give reasons. They are supposed to give some reason. If you say something, you must give a reason. They don't even give reason. They declare in oracular manner. For instance, we are all familiar with the principle that total reservation shall not exceed 50%. In the beginning, they used to say this because for 25 years after the Constitution came into being, they held that giving of reservation is an exception to equality. Equality means all application forms are to be treated equally. So you are treating some application forms separately, that's an exception to equality. And it stands to common sense that exceptions cannot be more than the rule, and therefore reservation cannot exceed 50%. This was the nothing, no greater logic than this was there. Reservation is an exception to equality. Exception cannot be more than the rule. It would defeat the whole meaning of exception. Therefore, reservation shall not exceed 50% is what they said in the beginning. Now, after 1975, they are supposed to have said reservation is no longer exception to equality, it's in furtherance of equality. Still, they stick to the old rule of 50% as maximum limit. There is no logic left. There is no reason. They still keep on proclaiming that limit without any rationale without any reason, any logic. And Supreme Court expects every lower court to give reasons. It won't give reasons. Lower courts are told you must give reasons because I have to sit in appeal. I must know why you have given the judgment. I won't give reasons because only God is there. And nobody goes to God for appeal. Now these are general bad habits of the courts, but these bad habits create chaos when they are applied to socially necessary legislation, socially necessary positive action. This is as far as the one instrument available in the Constitution for overcoming caste disabilities goes. Then I will touch the other very important, I think I don't have much time, very important law, which again has played an important role in giving strength to the especially scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. That is the penal law, usually described as the Prevention of Atrocities Act, Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act. All those who are active in Dalit movement or human rights movement or any kind of social movement are aware that this is a law. In fact, it's an unusual law in the sense that it is very well drafted. Usually, laws which are meant for the benefit of the powerful are very carefully drafted. Laws which are for the benefit of the weak are very badly drafted. I'm not making a rhetorical statement, I can prove it. They are very badly drafted because they just don't care. You make a law because somebody said you have to make a law and you make a law, that's all. Income Tax Act is very, very carefully drafted. Recent legislation that they have made for banks to recover loans are very carefully drafted. You look at the Protection of Human Rights Act, you can't make sense of the act because it's so careless, you don't even know what the act means. It's so carelessly drafted. Look at the Persons with Disabilities Act for physically disabled people, very badly drafted. The one well-drafted legislation which is for social justice is the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, well-drafted. Though there are a few defects, if I find time I will speak about them. But this act has been destroyed both by the executive and the judiciary. It is the only law which says that not doing your duty under this law itself is a crime. In India, not doing your job is not a crime. It is not even misconduct. You look at the conduct service rules of government servants, doing business is misconduct, talking politics is misconduct, not doing your job is not misconduct. Various other things are misconduct. Similarly, for a policeman not to do his job is not misconduct. This is one act which says specifically that willfully not doing your duty under this law is a crime, not merely misconduct, it's a crime, punishable with 1 year's imprisonment. If any other law had such a provision, the police would have been so careful in giving effect to the law, but they know that this will never be used by anybody, and so they are so casual about it. And courts have played their role in disabling this act in many ways. I'll give 2 or 3 instances. When our High Court of Andhra Pradesh has been at the lead in these matters. One is that many provisions in this act say, if a person belonging to scheduled caste or scheduled tribe is beaten, assaulted, insulted, humiliated on the ground that he or she belongs to SC or ST, then it's an offense. Now the courts say, if it is not clear that it is on the ground that the person belongs to SC or ST, this act is not applicable, and so we will strike down the case. Now there is one defect in this law which was not there in the earlier law, the Protection of Civil Rights Act, what was the original Anti-Untouchability Act, had a provision which says that if anyone commits an offense under this act, it is presumed by law that it was committed on the ground that the victim belongs to the scheduled caste. That was a presumption was there in the old law which was not included in this law, but courts could have read the presumption into it. Courts do so very often when they want to. A presumption could have been read that social structure being such, if a non-Dalit person insults or humiliates Dalit person, it can be presumed that the mindset of society has operated, it can be rebutted by the accused. That's a presumption. Instead, courts have said, because the law said on the ground that the victim is SC or ST, unless that is specifically stated there, we won't allow the prosecution to go on. And this is not at the end of the trial. This is on the complaint itself. So an illiterate Dalit who goes to a police station gives a complaint saying so-and-so came and abused me in the name of my caste or humiliated me, will also have to remember to add one sentence, he said this on the ground that I am a Dalit. Everybody has to read the law and go to the police station. Because that FIR itself will be questioned in the High Court by the upper caste person, and the High Court will say, because it is not said that on the ground that he is a Dalit, it is said, we are quashing the investigation. I am not joking, it's happening day in and out in the High Court. And these are not accidental. These are not accidental because if you sit in the High Court or any court for that matter and listen to the comments being made by the judiciary, only in the context of this act, that is the SC and ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, and in the context of domestic violence, section 498 of the Indian Penal Code, you repeatedly hear the judge commenting, these are all false cases. You will repeatedly hear the judge and the lawyer, everybody openly, casually laughing and joking and saying, we all know very well, we know my lord, these are all false cases. Judge also nods his head that these laws are misused, abused. No, every law is misused and abused. Lawyers are there mainly for that. They are not meant for implementing law, they are for misusing and abusing law. That's the whole profession. And some laws, in fact, are meant only for being misused, like Income Tax Act is meant for being misused. Income tax practitioner is one who will tell you how to misuse the Income Tax Act. He is a very noble practitioner, he can become a judge also. So it's not accidental that only the misuse of these particular statutes is commented upon. It is not accidental because the mindset is that these laws should not be there at all. The mindset of the judiciary and the entire profession is that these laws should not have been made at all. Now they have been made, we'll pick holes in these laws, and in their enforcement, we won't see about how they are to be enforced. Another rule in this SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act says that an offence under the Act has to be investigated by a police officer of rank, Deputy Superintendent of Police, not by subordinate. It must have been only to ensure, because subordinate police officer presumably will be influenceable by the local upper caste people. Therefore, they wanted, I am assuming, a higher officer to do the investigation. What happens is, the subordinate will file a charge sheet. The accused will come to court and say, charge sheet was filed by a subordinate, you quash it, the High Court quashes the charge sheet. Something which is meant for the victim is used as a protection for the accused. And our High Court is doing it systematically. Some judges differed. It went before a larger bench. They also said it has to be quashed. There is another provision which says that if somebody humiliates a person belonging to the Dalit or Adivasi communities, the provision says humiliated in a place in public view. That's an offense. In a place in public view specifically means it need not be viewed by anybody. It's not as if you have to be humiliated only in the presence of some person, but if it's an open place, which could have been viewed by anybody, that is sufficient to make it an offense. High courts have systematically read down a place in public view to simply mean public view. So our High Court has given a number of judgments saying nobody was there, therefore it's not an offense. The law does not say so. Law does not say somebody must have seen the or heard the humiliation. Law says it should be an open place. At that point of time, nobody may have been there. It should be a place which is open, which could have been viewed by anybody, and not entirely a private place. It can even be somebody's house if the window is open. That also will be a place in public view. But our High Court interprets as saying practically reducing place in public view to simply public view. Now a different view has been taken by another judge, and what will happen we don't know. I am saying this because police and the judiciary have come together to destroy this law, and the various provisions of this of criminal trial have been abused by the accused to defeat the fundamental, a very important purpose of having this act at all, which purpose was to have a quick and efficacious trial. The whole point of having a special law, special courts, special public prosecutors was that in such offences, if the trial drags on for a long time, the victims will get demoralized. And the accused will again threaten them, will again use a number of methods of trying to cow them down, to wear down their resistance, wear down their determination. To avoid this, the law has intended, a special law has been made, special courts have been set up to ensure that cases are disposed of fast. And that's the purpose of the law, declared purpose of the law, not to be interpreted by anybody. It declared purpose of the law. Law itself says so, for quick and speedy disposal of the cases. That has to be kept in mind by all courts. At every stage, accused come to the higher court on some plea. The higher court stays the entire prosecution without even looking into what was the purpose of this law. And we have the classic case in Andhra Pradesh. We are now in the 15th anniversary year of that offense, a massacre of 8 Dalits in Sundur in Guntur district. It happened in August 1991. We are today in August 2006. The trial is still going on in Guntur after 15 years. And upper caste accused used every possible mechanism to come to the High Court, get it stayed for a long time. High Court judges did not even look into the purpose of the law. The purpose is speedy trial. Okay, if he has come to the court, you hear him that day itself, within 1 week, send it back one way or the other. No, you keep it pending. You stay the whole thing and keep it pending. The first they came to the court and said, the Dalits are all Christians, therefore they are not scheduled castes. Unfortunately, the Act defines scheduled caste as the same as in the Constitution. And we all know that converts to Christianity or Islam for various reasons which are entirely political, nothing to do with the social realities, they decided to exclude such converts from the definition of scheduled caste. Maybe in urban areas there is some difference between a convert and a non-converted SC, but in the villages it's all identical. They are not even treated differently. Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, we have huge areas where scheduled castes have converted to Christianity. There is no difference at all. Everybody knows this. It can be used only in a court of law or to defeat reservations. So they came to court saying they are Christians. So we can't be prosecuted under this act in the special court. The High Court kept it pending for a long time. Then the High Court said, let it be determined by the district court. Fortunately, the pastor of the local Baptist church came and said, they never come to my church at all, they are not Christians. He gave evidence. So it was accepted they are Dalits, not Christians. Then next stage, should the court hall be in Guntur or in the village where the atrocity took place? Government has the power to set up a court anywhere. It decided to set up in that village. Again they came to the High Court. Not once, twice they came to the High Court on this. Again got the whole thing straight. That act also empowers the government to appoint a special public prosecutor who is desired by the victims. It's again a very special law. Normally the victim has no choice. In fact, one of the defects of the Indian penal law, criminal law is the victim is only a witness. You are the victim of the offense. Once it goes to court, you are simply a witness and nothing else. But this act says that the victims can also say, we want that lawyer to prosecute. That is permitted by this law. So one civil rights lawyer is appointed by the government, that again they come to the High Court and challenge and get it. Legislature made a law is what the courts make of what the legislature made. And the courts have made this out of the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, that it is treated as an unwanted piece of legislation which unnecessarily interferes in the normal course of adjudication, unnecessarily interferes in the healthy course of social life, unnecessarily creates conflicts in villages. That's an attitude of the sub-inspector of police, it's the attitude of a judge sitting in a court. Majority, I am not denying exceptions are there. And that's how this act has been now almost made, I won't say useless, but its utility has been reduced so much. And of course, on this side also, the Dalit movement and the human rights movement, we too have not been able to really make use of the wide provisions available in the Act, except merely to file a complaint under Section 3, subsection 1, subsection 10. That is the only complaint that is filed. The number of provisions available, we have been repeatedly advising and trying to help, but the weakness of the Dalit movement, the weakness of Dalits themselves, their very backwardness makes it difficult for them to make full use of the law, which again becomes a disability. I think my 25 minutes is over, so I may have to stop here. I have briefly tried to tell you caste and law in the context of the Constitution, the most important provision being reservations, and criminal law, the most important being the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. And how, in particular, I have said how the courts have perverted law and the Constitution, which itself was imperfect in its, not in its goals, but in its instruments. I'll stop here. Maybe we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valagompal. If you come here, you can use this. Well, now, questions and comments. So those who ask questions or comments, please mention your name. That's for recording. Yes, please.
My name is Lakshmanan. I am come from MIDS. My question related to the reservation issue. That is, does the ICSSR institution and UGC is a complementary institution or a confronting institution? Because some of the ICSSR institution does not have a reservation and also refuse to even add a sentence. The institution is equal opportunity institution and the deprived section are encouraged to apply. A sentence is refused to carry the advertisement. Such a level of ICSSR institution is there. Few years back, there are a series of articles carried by EPW on the status of ICSSR institution, where they cover only how the academics, ICSSR research has been quality and other things. But they are completely negated how far the ICSSR institution are social sensitive sensitive to the social justice issue. See, I'm raising this issue because the larger context, what argument has been posed against when the people are demanding reservation in the ICSR institution, that ICSR institution are not a creation of a statute, and it is an autonomy body. So there is no need of following reservation, and despite being a 50% matching grant from the respective state and HRD ministry. How we deal with this kind of issues? Thank you.
See, the HRD can direct the ICSR institutions, that is the government of India can direct those institutions to implement reservations, and they will have to do so. Because the government has the power to implement reservations in every institution which is controlled by it. And I am sure ICSR institutions are controlled by the government, both in terms of policy and also in terms of finances. The defect lies with the government itself. And you are talking about the UGC. What is the attitude of UGC itself? Hyderabad University, which is a central university, which is bound by all law which applies to employment in central government, and therefore by the Mandal Commission. The Mandal Commission, the recommendations were upheld by the Supreme Court 14 years ago in 1992. Today we are in 2006. Till today, University of Hyderabad does not give reservations for OBCs. Now, that petition was filed in the High Court. High Court asked the UGC to say, what is your view? UGC won't even file an affidavit saying this is my view. And then we moved a contempt case against UGC. The chairman, Mr. Hari Gautam, he used to go to all yajnas and everywhere, wherever these things were being, he never comes to a court. Finally, we got him to the court. He came to the court, apologized for not telling his view, but still did not tell his view. And he has gone away. So UGC's attitude is no different from that of the ICSR. The question here is the attitude of the government of India. What is the government of India doing? It has every power in law to direct any institution under its control to give reservations. It is not doing so. And people are disabled because, as I said, the judgment of Supreme Court now says it's enabling provision, not your right. If the government gives, you take. You can't ask as a matter of right. It is what Justice Anand, who has now become chairman of the National Human Rights Commission, because to become chairman of NHRC, no qualification is required other than that you are a former Chief Justice of India. Nothing more is required. So he is sitting there.
I liked your presentation immensely. I am Valerian Rodriguez. But just to poke some devil's doubts in your presentation. Now, if you think that the kind of law that exists is not favorably disposed towards backward classes, and particularly Dalits, why do you want to suggest at the end that Dalits have not come to explore the range of possibilities that law itself offers? Why should Dalits invest their energies, time, and resources into a project which you yourself seem to be suggesting, basically keeps them in bondedness? This is one. The second one is, I thought that there are two central provisions within the constitutional provisions. One is the provisions on backward classes, and I entirely go with your argument. But there are other provisions for scheduled castes exclusive. Now, there has been a huge controversy in India whether those provisions have been good or bad for Dalits. But I have a feeling that today that argument is largely settled in terms of organized Dalit opinion, saying that reservations have been good for Dalits. Now, these are constitutional provisions. What is your comment on this?
So the first question is concerned, I think I specifically said the Prevention of Atrocities Act is a well-drafted law. It's a good law, quite a comprehensive law, drafted by some people who had a notion of what really happens in... My point was that the law has been enervated by the executive and the judiciary in giving effect to it, judiciary in interpreting it. And therefore, it is worthwhile fighting. We are fighting, it is worthwhile fighting to ensure that the spirit of the law is actually implemented. There are some defects are there. I said, for instance, the presumption. Given the nature of our society, if somebody who is a non-Dalit humiliates a Dalit, it should be presumed that it is done on the ground of caste. It is for the person to rebut it, saying, I had some other reason. The lack of the presumption is a defect. Such defects are there, but the law itself is basically good and well drafted. In fact, I also say it is a rare case of a law for social justice which is well drafted. That's the reason why I believe it should be used, and it should be used much more extensively. It can be used much more extensively. As far as reservations are concerned, I don't think there is any real doubt that they have done a lot of good, and they are still capable of doing a lot of good. Problem is that the withdrawal syndrome which is now, we are now seeing, the government, it says it has every power. I want to say this because the Supreme Court is sending out wrong signals. The only difference between public sector and private sector is, in the case of public sector, government can itself give reservations by merely passing an executive order. In the case of private sector, it has to make a law. That is the only difference, nothing else is in the Constitution. Rubbish is being written by the judges of Supreme Court, saying that it has no power to direct the private sector, even by law, to give reservations. That is rubbish. But then with the gradual withdrawal of the government from various activities, handing over things to the private sector, it effectively amounts also to withdrawal from reservations as a principle. And instead of Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister, saying, we will give reservations, he goes on saying, you tell us how you will discharge your social obligation. He says this to Reliance and Tata and so on. The question is, what will Manmohan Singh do to discharge his obligations? Forget about Reliance and Tata. He, as a leader, the Prime Minister of the country, what is he and his government going to do for discharge their obligations? He says, you tell us what you will do to discharge your obligations. They will put very nice, they will say, we will do everything possible to encourage Dalits to become directors. Everything possible, that's all. It may turn out to be impossible later. In this context, I think the struggle to ensure that these provisions of reservation are extended to the private sector, implemented honestly, is essential. And all this talk of reservations going only to the rich among the Dalits and so on is rubbish, which the upper castes are doling out. That has to be opposed.
Valgopal, I don't think you require any appreciation. It has been your continuous commitment to the critique of law. Is it working? Yes. I must share with you that since yesterday we are finding problems with the institutions. And there are some participants who think that you can still retrieve and recover institutions, which is fine, I suppose. But your argument goes against what we have been holding. Our faith and our confidence in institution is really wearing down. I just wanted to make a small supporting point. I agree with you that the courts at the lower level are a little more castious than the higher ups. Let us give them concession. And I also agree with you that this, by not presuming the mindset, also declares their caste, a sort of casteism, the mindset which is built up around casteism. It is against the Dalits, for example. The presumption is not, it's not presumed. But in a reverse fashion, presumptions is very active. And let me give an example of the Bhauri Devi judgment of I think the district court, where the honorable justice says, how can a Brahmin ever think of raping an untouchable woman? So the presumption is there that you just can't do it. Yeah, so that's the point.
I will disagree with your initial observation that casteism is less in the higher courts and more in the lower. As a matter of fact, even in terms of composition, you will find more judges from a deprived background in the lower judiciary than the higher judiciary. And higher judiciary is very bad, especially in its view of caste. Maybe in other areas it's a little more mixed. And in general about the Supreme Court, one can say this: for the last 10 to 15 years, it has been at the forefront of rewriting law in defense of what we call globalization. Is not merely about the economy. It's a total attitude towards society, social development, history, human rights, everything. And Supreme Court has been at the forefront. Parliament has not amended any law. If you actually see, Parliament has not amended a single law to suit globalization. Supreme Court is doing the job. It is doing it very effectively, and sitting there where they say that criticizing us is contempt of court and we don't have to be elected, they are the most meritorious. They come through merit. So that part of your comment I disagree.
No more questions? We have 5 more minutes if you have, some comments to make or some clarification to seek. Yes.
In 1989, when this particular law, Balu, you know, I'm calling you Balu, I hope it can be done. When in 1989, when this act was passed, Upendra Bakshi wrote, he is not present here, but he gave a public lecture and I was present for the public lecture. And he wrote on this particular act, saying that it is going to be a major revolution in law. And partly building on the kind of arguments that you were suggesting. Now, the legal community might perceive something as very radical, but as you are arguing now, even these radical laws eventually begin to be so puny. Could you comment on this? That very often radical judgments, even the 1975 judgment that you are referring to, eventually they turn out to be so puny in terms of their reach and implications. Do you wholly ascribe it to the kind of society that we are in, or is it there is something built into the legal institution which actually leads to this kind of an outcome?
Essentially, it has to do with the kind of society we are. You said about legal community. The entire legal community never reacted to the 1989 Act like Upendra Bakshi did. He was in a minority. You ask the majority of lawyers sitting in any court, they'll talk of this act with all the contempt that they have for the Dalits. That is the attitude, frankly. What happens is when you make a law which goes against social structure, it comes into a collision with social structure. Now, unless that, in that collision, on the other side, there is a very powerful social structure. On this side, there has to be a force which will push it, which will fight, which will struggle and overcome. If that is wanting, if that is lacking, then the law will be. Law itself is nothing, neither. It's only something which enables people to do something. The people should be able to get organized and fight, and that's where the weakness of organized Dalit movement comes in. I think about Andhra Pradesh, we can say that approximately from 1985 to 91, 92, we had a good organized Dalit movement. Subsequently, it has been badly splintered for various reasons. I think it is true of Karnataka, I happen to know. Tamil Nadu also to some extent. So the social structure itself not only was it historically unequal, it continues to be unequal also in terms of political strength. That has weakened the act itself. I would put that as the main reason.
Yes, Peter.
Yes.
The question of institutions keeps coming up, so I'd like to pursue the discussion that's emerging. Now, you have, I think, very eloquently described the perversion of institutions. Now, you must tell us, what is the sources of this perversion? Is it a constitutive design failure, in the sense that the institution has been constituted in a perversive manner? Or is the institution fine, but the operators are perversive? And therefore, no reform, no reform suggestions are possible. Secondly, if this is the case, then are alternative institutions need to be constituted? And secondly, what is the nature of these alternative institutions? And let's take the case of law itself.
In the context of the judiciary, what has constituted the judiciary is the constitution itself. And I think I said in the very beginning, one of the defects of the constitution is that its goals are by and large acceptable to those with a democratic view, but its instruments are weak. In that sense, the very constitution of the institutions is such that a reliance is placed upon the executive, the administration to push through the goals of the constitution rather than empowering the people through proper constitutional instruments to achieve it. To this is added, as you have said, the operators of the institutions, not in terms of individuals but social classes. In the case of caste, it is social castes, the communities which are sitting there. Even if you have a judge who either comes from a deprived community or has a point of view which is congenial to the rights and welfare of such communities, the way they are hesitant to express it when they are sitting in the court. Justice Sawant was a judge of the Supreme Court. Only after he retired, one came to know that he is an ardent follower of Jyotiba Phule. It was never known when he was sitting in the Supreme Court. He is a very intelligent judge, has written very good judgments, but that inhibition that he shall not express his point of view, which others who have a Brahminical point of view or a capitalist point of view never hesitate. So here you have the failure of the system through the human aspect is not only that those who are from dominant positions in social life are sitting there, even those who come from the dominated positions feel inhibited. The totality of it has functioned, I think. As far as the Constitution is concerned, if at all we are going to, there was discussion about review of the Constitution. If you are going to review it, the urge for review came from a negative, the Golwalkarite viewpoint, which was destructive of the positive elements of the Constitution. But a review for providing more enabling instruments to the people would be fruitful. The other is a constant public criticism which will strengthen the voices of those in the judiciary who are for a greater democratic perspective. And for the internal composition also, demand has repeatedly been coming up. Just as we have reservations in the academics and other areas, why not also in the judiciary? These I think are necessary. Whether they are sufficient, I cannot say. These are necessary to begin with at least. Susie had a question.
Well, Gopal, since I know you so well, I'll take issue with you without any preliminaries. One of the things that I find very difficult in the way you approach the law is your faith in it. It's not, you do criticize it. Everything that you say is a criticism of how the law is functioning, how judges behave, how actual procedures are taken and misused and so on. There's an enormous critique of what is happening. But underlying all that is a total faith in that institution. And I think that's the strength with which you proceed, and you know that I would be grateful that we have that strength available to us in this context. But I think that is where the relationship of a political unit to an institution is obscured in that kind of faith in the institution. That a political challenge to an existing order will only come through not a rejection of the institution, not necessarily a wholesale rejection of the institution, but some kind of pressure at the institution itself, that there must be a challenge of the law and the operations of the law, the conceptual formation of the law, its mode of thinking, not just the challenge of the corruption of the law, which I think you do with as much imagination as I could ever hope that anyone would.
I don't really have that much faith in the law. In fact, I began by saying that the Constitution itself is inadequate. The Constitution is the foundational law. It is inadequate in the sense that it does not empower the people to achieve the goals and rather dependent upon the administration, and that would be a fundamental critique of the law. If I have spoken more positively, it's because the second instance I took up, that is the 1989 Act. That's a rare instance of a well-drafted law, which I have pointed out one defect, that the presumption is not there, which was there in the Protection of Civil Rights Act. Otherwise, it's a well-drafted law. If I had taken some other law, I would have probably criticized the law more than the judges. So I definitely don't have any such, and even if I had such a faith before I became a lawyer, after becoming a lawyer, it's impossible to have such faith in law, because we know what law is.
I'm afraid we have running out of time. You want to say something?
Isn't there a distinction between law and laws? That there would be bad laws, badly drafted laws, well-drafted laws, and so on. But that if we're saying here is an institution called the law, the judiciary, the law, it's a very central institution of liberal political life, that the tension with that institution itself is something that practitioners like you, appellants, victims, etc., should be encouraged to develop.
That's at an altogether different level of discussion, I think. Whether we can imagine a society which does away with the notion of a central law itself. It is a discussion which is possible, but not in the context in which I have been asked to speak today. That I would put it that way.
So we'll wind up the discussion on this paper now. Let me thank Bal Gopal for a very forthright presentation on behalf of all of you. And